The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the small Tennessee town into a watercolor painting where all the edges blurred together. Kenny Rogers pulled his old Chevy into the gravel parking lot of what used to be Pine Ridge Baptist Church, the headlights cutting through the evening mist like tired eyes squinting at memories. He wasn't supposed to be here. Hell, he wasn't supposed to be anywhere these days. The tour had ended 6 months ago, and retirement felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. Too loose in some places, too tight in others. But something about this place had called to him during his afternoon drive. The way old buildings sometimes whisper to people who've spent too many years on stages and in hotel rooms. The church had been abandoned for over a decade, according to the rusted sign that hung askew near the front steps. White paint peeled from its wooden siding like old skin, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had weathered to the color of storm clouds. But the steeple still stood proud against the darkening sky, and the front door, though faded, remained unlocked. Kenny pushed the door open with a creak that echoed through the empty sanctuary. The smell hit him first, not the mustiness he'd expected, but something warmer. Old wood, traces of furniture polish, and beneath it all, the faint scent of roses. Someone had been caring for this place. Rows of wooden pews stretched before him, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of Sunday services. A few hymnals still rested in the holders, their pages yellowed but neatly arranged. Candles in glass holders lined the windowsills, unlit but clean, as if waiting for the right moment to chase away the shadows. As Kenny walked down the center aisle, his footsteps muffled by a burgundy carpet that had seen better days, he noticed more signs of quiet maintenance. The floors had been swept recently. The altar at the front of the church bore a simple white cloth, freshly laundered and pressed. A small arrangement of wildflowers sat in a mason jar next to an old Bible that looked like it had been read so many times the binding had given up trying to hold the pages together. But it was what he found behind the pulpit that stopped him cold. There, tucked against the wall where no congregation could see, was a small wooden stool. On it sat a notebook, its pages filled with handwriting in careful cursive. Next to the notebook lay a worn photograph of a young woman in a wedding dress, her smile bright enough to light up the dusty corners of the old church. Kenny picked up the notebook with trembling hands. The first page read, "Letters to Margaret, because I know you're listening somewhere." He shouldn't have read further. Privacy was sacred, and these words weren't meant for strangers. But something in that first line pulled at him, the way a melody sometimes grabs hold of your heart before your mind can tell it to let go. "My dearest Margaret, it's been 3 years since you went home to Jesus, and I still come here every Tuesday and Thursday to talk to you. Pastor William says I should move on, find myself a nice widower lady from over in Cookville, but he never understood what we had. 47 years of marriage, and I still expect to see you in the kitchen every morning, humming that hymn you loved while you make coffee strong enough to wake the dead. I've been taking care of our church the way you always did. I know it's officially closed, but buildings need tending just like people do. I swept the floors today and arranged some of those black-eyed Susans you planted behind the parsonage. They're still blooming, Maggie. Even with nobody to admire them, they're still blooming. The loneliness is getting heavier, I won't lie to you. Sometimes I catch myself setting 2 plates for dinner or saving the funny parts of the newspaper to read to you later. Dr. Peterson says it's normal, part of the grieving process, but normal doesn't make it hurt any less. I keep thinking about that night before you passed, when you made me promise to keep singing. The Lord gave you that voice for a reason, Harold, you said. Don't you dare bury it with me. But how can I sing when the only person who ever really heard me is gone? I love you, sweetheart. I'll see you next Tuesday. Forever yours, Harold." Kenny's hands shook as he turned the page. Entry after entry, spanning months, each one a conversation with a ghost, each one breaking his heart a little more. Harold, whoever he was, had been pouring his soul onto these pages week after week in a church that nobody visited anymore. The entries told a story that Kenny recognized in his bones. Harold had been the church's music director for over 20 years, leading the choir, playing piano for Sunday services, organizing the annual Christmas pageant. Margaret had been the church secretary, the one who remembered everyone's birthdays and made sure the flowers were fresh and the coffee was strong. They'd been the heartbeat of this little congregation, the kind of couple that made everyone else believe in forever. But congregations age, and young families move to bigger towns with better opportunities. One by one, the pews had emptied until there weren't enough people left to keep the doors open. The building had been officially closed, but Harold had kept coming, kept caring for it the way Margaret would have wanted. The more recent entries grew sadder, more desperate. Harold's health was failing. His children lived far away and rarely called. The loneliness was eating him alive. And the church, their church, was all he had left. Kenny found himself crying before he realized it, tears falling onto pages that had already been dampened by someone else's grief. He'd spent 40 years singing songs about heartbreak and loss, but he'd never felt it this raw, this immediate. This wasn't performance, this was real life, stripped of all its artifice and pretense. He was so absorbed in reading that he didn't hear the front door open, didn't hear the soft footsteps on the carpet, didn't realize he wasn't alone until a gentle voice behind him said, "I'm sorry, but the church is closed." Kenny spun around, clutching the notebook to his chest. An elderly man stood in the doorway, backlit by the parking lot lights. He was small and slight, with silver hair that looked like it had been combed with careful attention, and clothes that had been pressed despite their obvious age. In his hands, he carried a small toolbox and a grocery bag. "I'm sorry," Kenny said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to intrude. The door was open and I just... You're reading my letters." It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Harold, and Kenny knew without asking that this had to be Harold, walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps careful and measured. "I shouldn't have," Kenny said, setting the notebook back on the stool. "I'm sorry, I was just... lost." Harold finished for him. "I know the feeling." They stood there in the dim light, two men who had never met but who recognized something in each other. Harold set down his toolbox and grocery bag, then moved to light the candles on the windowsills with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. "Are you the one who's been taking care of this place?" Kenny asked. Harold nodded. "Margaret and I, we gave our lives to this church. Seemed wrong to let it just... die." He lit the last candle and turned to face Kenny. "You look familiar. Are you from around here?" Kenny almost lied. It would have been easier, safer. But something about this place, about Harold's quiet dignity, made dishonesty feel like sacrilege. "I'm Kenny Rogers," he said quietly. Harold's eyes widened slightly, then crinkled at the corners. "Well, I'll be damned. Kenny Rogers, in my church." He chuckled softly. "Margaret always said you had one of the finest voices she'd ever heard. Played your records all the time while she was cooking." "Your letters," Kenny said, gesturing toward the notebook. "They're beautiful. The way you write about her, about this place. It's like poetry." Harold's face flushed slightly. "Just an old man talking to himself." "No," Kenny said firmly. "It's love. Pure, honest love. I've written songs about love my whole life. But what you've written there, that's the real thing." Harold moved to the front pew and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. "Lot of good it does me now. Love's not much use when you're the only one left to feel it." Kenny sat beside him, uninvited but somehow welcome. "You mentioned in your letters that Margaret wanted you to keep singing." "She did. But what's the point of singing when nobody's listening?" Kenny looked around the small sanctuary, at the candles casting dancing shadows on the walls, at the flowers Harold had placed with such care, at the evidence of love that filled every corner of this forgotten place. "Someone's always listening," he said softly. "And even if they weren't, some things are worth doing just because they matter. Your wife knew that. That's why she asked you to keep singing." Harold was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap. "I used to lead the choir here, 23 years. We weren't the best singers in the county, but we sang with heart. Margaret said that's what mattered. She was right. Haven't sung a note since the day we closed the doors. Don't even know if I remember how." Kenny stood and walked to the old piano that sat to the side of the pulpit. Its wood was scarred and faded, but when he pressed a few keys, the sound that emerged was surprisingly clear. Someone, Harold undoubtedly, had been keeping it tuned. "What was Margaret's favorite hymn?" Kenny asked. Harold's voice was barely a whisper. "Amazing Grace. She hummed it every morning while she made coffee." Kenny's fingers found the familiar chords, and the opening notes of the beloved hymn filled the small church. He'd played this song 1,000 times, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like a prayer. "I once was lost, but now am found," he sang, his voice rich and warm in the candlelit space. "Was blind, but now I see." He stopped after the first verse and looked at Harold. "Your turn." Harold shook his head. "I can't. It's been too long. Margaret's listening," Kenny said gently. "She's been waiting 3 years to hear you sing again." Harold's eyes filled with tears, but he stood slowly and walked to the front of the church. For a moment he just stood there, looking up at the simple wooden cross that hung above the altar. Then, in a voice that trembled at first but grew stronger with each word, he began to sing. "'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved." His voice wasn't professionally trained, but it carried something that no amount of training could provide. Authenticity. Pain and hope and love and loss, all wrapped up in a melody that had comforted millions of people across the centuries. Kenny joined him for the third verse, their voices blending in harmony. Harold's tenor, weathered by age and grief, rose above Kenny's baritone like a bird learning to fly again. "Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." When the last note faded, Harold sank back into the pew, tears streaming down his face. But for the first time in 3 years, they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of release, of remembering, of a heart that had forgotten how to hope beginning to remember. "She heard that," Harold whispered. "Somehow, I know she heard that." Kenny sat beside him again, his own eyes wet. "She's been hearing you all along. Every letter, every time you swept these floors, every wildflower you picked. That's love, Harold. That's what love looks like when it doesn't know how to quit." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, surrounded by the soft glow of candles and the presence of something larger than themselves. The rain outside had grown softer, no longer pounding against the windows, but falling in a gentle rhythm that seemed to echo the peaceful beating of their hearts. Finally, Harold spoke, his voice stronger now, as if the singing had awakened something that had been sleeping too long. "You know, Kenny, I've been thinking about what you said. About someone always listening." He paused, running his weathered fingers along the edge of the hymnal in his lap. "Maybe I haven't been as alone as I thought." Kenny nodded, understanding flowing between them like a current. "Tell me about your choir. What were they like?" Harold's face softened, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. "Oh, they were something special. Not because of their voices, mind you, but because of their hearts. There was Eleanor Pritchard, our soprano. She was 82 when we closed, and she'd been singing in this church since she was 12 years old. Voice like a morning bird, even at her age." He stood up and walked to the choir loft, running his hand along the empty chairs. "And Tommy Williams, our bass. He was the pastor's son, you know. Came back from Vietnam different than when he left. But when he sang, you could hear the boy he used to be. The boy who believed in goodness again." Kenny followed him, drawn by the stories, by the way Harold's voice took on new life as he remembered. "They sound like they were family to you." They were. More than family in some ways. We chose each other week after week, year after year. We weren't related by blood, but we were connected by something deeper. By the music we made together, by the faith we shared, by the way we showed up for each other when life got hard. Harold picked up a piece of sheet music from the piano, yellowed with age. This was our last song together. Blessed Assurance. We sang it the Sunday before we officially closed the doors. Everyone was crying, but we sang it anyway. Had to. It was our way of saying goodbye. Kenny took the sheet music, studying the penciled notes in the margins, the evidence of countless rehearsals and performances. "Would you mind if we tried it? Together?" Harold looked surprised. "You know it?" "I know it. But I'd like to hear how your choir used to sing it. Show me." For the next hour, Harold taught Kenny the specific harmonies his choir had developed over the years. He explained how Eleanor would hold the high notes a little longer than written, how Tommy would come in just a beat early on the chorus, how Margaret would play the piano with a gentle touch that made even the most familiar songs sound fresh and new. As they worked through the song, Harold's voice grew stronger, more confident. The music seemed to unlock memories that had been buried under layers of grief and loneliness. He told Kenny about Christmas pageants and Easter services, about weddings and funerals, about the countless Sunday mornings when this little church had been filled with voices raised in harmony. Margaret used to say that singing in church was like praying twice. Harold said as they finished the song. Once with your words, and once with your heart. She said that's why it mattered so much to get it right. Not perfect, but right. From the heart. Kenny understood. In all his years of performing, he'd learned the difference between singing for applause and singing for something deeper. Tonight, in this small abandoned church, he was remembering what that felt like. Would you mind if we sang one more? For Margaret? Kenny smiled. What would you like to sing? How Great Thou Art. It was the last song she heard before she went home. As they began the familiar hymn, Kenny felt something shift in the atmosphere of the church. It wasn't just the two of them anymore. In the harmony of their voices, in the space between the notes, there was room for others. Room for Eleanor and Tommy and all the other choir members who had once filled this place with music. Room for Margaret, whose presence seemed to hover in the candlelit air like a blessing. O Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made. Harold sang, his voice clear and strong now. Kenny joined him, their voices weaving together in perfect harmony. I see the stars. I hear the rolling thunder. Thy power throughout the universe displayed. When they reached the chorus, both men felt it. That moment when music transcends technique and becomes something sacred. Then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee. How great thou art! How great thou art! As the familiar hymn filled the abandoned church, Kenny understood why he'd been drawn to this place. Not by accident, not by chance, but by the same grace that had led a broken-hearted man to keep loving a woman who lived now only in memory, and a church that existed now only in the heart of one faithful caretaker. When they finished singing, Harold reached into his grocery bag and pulled out a thermos and 2 paper cups. Coffee, he said simply. Margaret always said church wasn't church without coffee. As they sat drinking coffee that was indeed strong enough to wake the dead, Harold told Kenny about the 47 years he'd spent loving Margaret, about the church that had been their second home, about the loneliness that had been his constant companion since she'd passed. He spoke about their courtship, how they'd met in this very church when she was the new pianist and he was the shy young man who'd been too nervous to ask her out for 3 months. He told Kenny about their wedding day, how Margaret had insisted on having the ceremony here even though her family wanted something grander. He described the way she'd looked in her simple white dress, standing at the altar where they'd just been singing, promising to love him for better or worse. She kept that promise, Harold said, his voice thick with emotion. Even when worse seemed like it might win. When I lost my job at the plant, when we lost our first baby, when the doctors told us we'd never have children of our own, she never stopped believing that better was coming. Kenny shared his own stories of love and loss, of the marriages that hadn't worked out, of the children he'd barely known because he'd been too busy chasing the next song, the next show, the next moment in the spotlight. He talked about the emptiness that had been growing inside him, the way success had become a prison of its own making. It's funny, Kenny said, swirling the coffee in his cup. I've sung for millions of people, but I don't think I've ever felt as heard as I do sitting here with you tonight. Harold nodded. Margaret used to say that the size of the audience doesn't matter. What matters is whether the music comes from a true place, whether it connects one heart to another. They talked until the coffee was gone and the candles had burned low. 2 men who had never met before tonight, finding in each other a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on the difficult journey of being human. You know, Harold said as they prepared to leave. Margaret always said that sometimes God sends us exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. I thought she was just being Margaret, always seeing the silver lining, but maybe she was right. Kenny helped Harold blow out the candles and lock up the church. As they stood in the parking lot, Harold turned to him. Would you maybe come back sometime? I'm here every Tuesday and Thursday. It gets lonely talking to yourself. Kenny smiled. I'd like that. And Harold? Next time I come, I'm bringing my guitar. Margaret deserves a proper concert. Harold's face lit up like Christmas morning. She'd love that. She always said you were her favorite singer. As Kenny drove away, he looked back at the small church in his rearview mirror. It looked different now, less abandoned, more like a place where miracles could happen, where 2 strangers could meet and discover they weren't strangers at all, just fellow travelers on the same difficult road. The next Tuesday, Kenny returned as promised, guitar in hand. Harold was waiting for him, and this time he'd brought more than coffee. He'd brought photo albums filled with pictures of Margaret, of the church in its heyday, of the choir members who had become their family. They spent the evening singing and looking at photographs, sharing stories and memories, building a bridge between their different worlds. 3 months later, Kenny Rogers quietly purchased the Pine Ridge Baptist Church, not to turn it into a museum or a tourist attraction, but to give it back to Harold, to give Harold's love a proper home. Every Tuesday and Thursday they met there to sing and talk and remember. Sometimes other people joined them, former congregation members who heard about the informal services, locals who were curious about the famous singer who'd found something precious in their forgotten church. Harold never stopped writing his letters to Margaret, but now they were filled with stories of new friendships, of music returned to a place that had been too quiet for too long, of love that had learned to expand rather than contract in the face of loss. And Kenny never forgot the lesson he'd learned in that candlelit sanctuary, that the most powerful songs aren't always the ones that make it to the radio. Sometimes they're the ones sung by broken hearts in empty churches, by voices that tremble with grief and hope in equal measure, by people who understand that love doesn't end when the beloved departs. It just learns to sing a different tune. The church still stands today, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, if you drive by, you might hear voices raised in harmony, carrying hymns and hope out into the Tennessee twilight. And if you're very lucky, you might catch a glimpse of 2 old men at the piano, making music that would make the angels weep with joy. Because sometimes, the most beautiful songs are the ones we sing not for fame or fortune, but for the simple sacred act of remembering that we are not alone in this world, that somewhere, someone is listening. That love, like music, never truly dies. It just waits for the right moment to be heard again. Kenny learned this truth in the months that followed that first rainy evening. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he drove the winding roads to Pine Ridge Baptist Church, his guitar case in the back seat, and something approaching peace in his heart. Harold was always there first, having swept the floors and arranged fresh flowers, having lit the candles and tuned the old piano with the careful attention of a man who understood that small acts of love were the foundation of everything that mattered. Their friendship deepened with each visit. Harold shared stories that Margaret had told him about her childhood, about the grandfather who taught her to play piano on an old upright that had 3 broken keys. Kenny spoke about his own journey through music, about the nights when the applause felt hollow, and the mornings when he wondered if any of it had meant anything at all. One Thursday evening in late autumn, Harold arrived at the church carrying a worn leather satchel. Inside were more than 50 years of church programs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and photographs that chronicled the life of a community that had loved deeply and laughed often. There was Margaret at 22, her hands poised over the piano keys, looking up at the camera with eyes that sparkled with mischief and faith in equal measure. There was the Christmas pageant of 1987, when little Sarah Beth Williams forgot her lines as the angel Gabriel and simply stood there grinning until the whole congregation burst into laughter and applause. "She saved everything," Harold said, carefully turning the pages of a photo album. Margaret believed that memories were sacred things, that they deserved to be preserved and honored. "Every moment matters," she used to say, "even the small ones, especially the small ones." Kenny studied a photograph of the church's annual barbecue. The parking lot filled with families, children running between the tables, while adults lingered over plates of ribs and corn on the cob. It was a scene of simple contentment, of people who knew they belonged somewhere, to someone, to something larger than themselves. "Tell me about this one," Kenny said, pointing to a picture of Margaret standing beside a young woman in a wedding dress. Harold's face softened. "That's Linda Sue Porter. Well, Linda Sue McAllister now." She was maybe 19 when this was taken, scared out of her mind about getting married. Her own mama had passed the year before, and she didn't have anyone to help her get ready. Margaret spent the whole morning with her, doing her hair, helping her into her dress, telling her all the things a mama would have said. He paused, his finger tracing the edge of the photograph. "Linda Sue was back here just last month, you know. Heard about what we were doing and drove down from Nashville. She's got 4 kids now, runs her own business. But she sat right there in that pew and cried like a baby, talking about how Margaret had been the mama she needed that day." Kenny understood. Music had taught him that some moments transcend time, that certain people leave imprints on our hearts that never fade. Margaret had been that kind of person for this community, a steady presence, a safe harbor, a voice that sang hope into the darkest corners of people's lives. As winter settled over Tennessee, their Tuesday and Thursday gatherings began to grow. Former congregation members heard about the informal services and started showing up, drawn by curiosity and the deep human need to reconnect with something they'd lost. Eleanor Pritchard, now 85 and walking with a cane, returned to her place in the soprano section, her voice still pure and strong. Tommy Williams drove down from Knoxville, his own children in tow, eager to show them the place where their daddy had learned to sing again after the war. Word spread quietly through the surrounding counties about the country music legend who had found something precious in their forgotten church. But Kenny made it clear from the beginning that this wasn't about him. This was about Harold and Margaret, about the community that had called this place home, about the timeless truth that some things matter more than fame or recognition. One evening in December, as they were practicing Christmas carols for the informal service they'd planned, Harold set down his hymnal and looked at Kenny with an expression of wonder and gratitude. "You know what Margaret would have said about all this?" he asked, gesturing around the church that was no longer empty, no longer silent. Kenny shook his head, waiting. "She would have said that love is like a song. You can't hoard it or keep it to yourself. The more you share it, the more beautiful it becomes, the further it travels, the more hearts it touches." Harold's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy now, not sorrow. She would have loved seeing this place alive again, seeing strangers become friends, seeing music bring people home. That Christmas Eve, Pine Ridge Baptist Church held its first service in over 3 years. The pews weren't full. There were maybe 40 people scattered throughout the sanctuary. But the love that filled the space was overwhelming. Kenny played guitar while Harold led the singing, their voices joined by others who remembered the words to Silent Night and O Holy Night and Amazing Grace. After the service, as people lingered over coffee and cookies that someone had thought to bring, Linda Sue McAllister approached Kenny with her teenage daughter in tow. "Mr. Rogers," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for bringing this place back to life. Margaret and Harold, they saved my life when I was this one's age." She put her arm around her daughter, who looked embarrassed but pleased to be included in the adult conversation. "I've told Emma here all about Miss Margaret, about how she could make anyone feel welcome, make anyone feel loved." Emma, all teenage awkwardness and hidden depth, looked around the small church with wonder. "Mom says Miss Margaret taught her how to play piano. Do you think someone could teach me?" Harold overhead and stepped forward, his face lighting up with purpose and joy. "Young lady, I think Margaret would be honored to have her piano played by someone new. When can you start?" And so the circle continued to widen. Emma McAllister became Harold's first piano student in over 3 years, her young fingers bringing new life to keys that had been silent too long. Other children followed, drawn by the promise of music lessons and the kind of patient, gentle instruction that Harold provided. He taught them the same way Margaret had taught Linda Sue all those years ago, with love, with patience, with the understanding that music was about more than hitting the right notes. Kenny watched it all unfold with a sense of amazement and deep satisfaction. This was what he'd been searching for without even knowing it. Not another hit song or sold-out concert, but this simple, profound connection to something that mattered. He'd found it in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely teacher, a grieving widower who had never stopped believing that love was worth the effort it required. One warm evening in late spring, as they sat on the church steps after a particularly joyful evening of music and fellowship, Harold pulled out a letter from his pocket. It was addressed to Margaret like all the others, but this one was different. "My dearest Margaret," he read aloud, his voice steady and strong. "Tonight I want to tell you about joy. Not happiness. That comes and goes like weather. But joy, the deep kind that lives in your bones and changes the way you see the world. I found it again, sweetheart. Here in our church, with our piano, surrounded by people who understand that love doesn't end when the beloved goes home." He paused, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the Tennessee sky. "I think you sent him to me, didn't you? Kenny, you knew I needed someone to remind me that I wasn't alone, that the music we made together was worth preserving, worth sharing. You always were smarter than me, Maggie, always could see further down the road." Kenny felt his throat tighten with emotion. In all his years of writing songs, He'd never captured anything as beautiful as this man's simple, honest love for his wife, his community, his faith in the goodness of people. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. The words of the familiar hymn hung in the air between them, no longer sung but felt, lived, embodied in the transformation that had taken place in both their lives. In the end, that's what Harold found in his weekly visits to the church. What Kenny found in his chance encounter with a grieving widower. What Margaret had known all along. That grace has a way of showing up in the most unexpected places, wearing the most unexpected faces, carrying the most unexpected gifts. It shows up in the form of a country music legend who finds himself crying over love letters written to a woman he never met. It appears as a lonely widower who discovers that sharing his grief can transform it into something beautiful. It manifests as a community that rises from the ashes of loss to create something new, something hopeful, something eternal. The Pine Ridge Baptist Church still stands today. Its doors open every Tuesday and Thursday evening to anyone who needs a place to belong, a voice to join with, a reminder that they are not alone in this world. Harold still writes his letters to Margaret, but now they're filled with stories of weddings and baptisms, of children learning their first hymns, of voices raised in harmony that would make the angels themselves pause to listen. Kenny still comes faithfully, his guitar case in hand, his heart full of a peace he'd never thought possible. He's learned that the most important audience isn't the one that pays for tickets or buys albums. It's the one that shows up week after week, not for entertainment but for connection, for community, for the simple miracle of human voices joined together in song. And sometimes, on particularly quiet evenings when the music is especially sweet and the candlelight casts just the right shadows, they can almost see her there in the front pew. Margaret, smiling that bright smile, nodding in approval at the love that has grown from the seeds she planted so many years ago. All you have to do is be willing to listen. All you have to do is be willing to sing. All you have to do is believe that love, like music, is stronger than death, deeper than grief, more enduring than time itself. Because in the end, that's all any of us really need. Someone to sing with, someone to love, someone to remember us when we're gone. And if we're very lucky, very blessed, we might just discover that the song never really ends. It just gets passed along to the next voice, the next heart, the next soul brave enough to believe that they matter, that their music matters, that their love will echo through eternity. In Pine Ridge Baptist Church, the music plays on. And somewhere, Margaret is smiling, knowing that love always finds a way to sing itself back to life.